Good morning, intellectuals. My name is Cassidy Cottle, and welcome to the first video in what has the potential to be a very long series on the basics of psychology. This is what you're probably going to see in either an advanced psychology class in high school or an introductory psychology class in college. So, the general overview of what psychology truly is it's the examination of the relationship between the brain, the physical brain, the mind, which is the cognitive experience that we all have. It's often referred to as consciousness. And then your behavior. So what neurons fire in your brain to allow you to flex your bicep, or what neurons fire when you're telling a lie, and then which other ones fire when you absolutely know that you've been caught in said lie. This is different from the origins of psychology because when it began, it was more of a philosophical concept, and you can read a lot about Rene Descartes' opinions on the relationship between what he calls mind and body. So he viewed mind as one thing, and then brain and behavior as a totally different experience under the category of body. But that's a different time and a different video. So to get as small as possible right now, we're going to look at what a neuron is. And pardon my horrific drawing skills, but I'm going to try really hard to create something that looks somewhat like a neuron, but I'm positive there are much nicer pictures in a textbook or on the internet, but we're gonna try. It looks kind of like a tree with roots turned on its side, or maybe a really hairy, frayed lollipop, if you want to look at it that way. I've always liked the tree metaphor better anyways. So what we have here is a cell, and what it does primarily is it electrically sends signals. Now, the most important thing is that the signal will always travel in one direction. It can always go from dendrites, which are on the left of my glorious drawing, and it travels from the dendrites down the axon to the terminal buttons, which are at the very end of what look to be sort of the roots of our metaphorical cell tree. And it never will go in the reverse direction, which makes sense considering it's an electrical signal. Then the other part of the cell that's kind of ignored in this process is the cell body, which holds the nucleus. But the dendrites receive the signal, the axon carries the signal down, and the terminal buttons send the signal forward. And because of each of those roles, it's impossible for the signal to go in the reverse direction. The signal will always run from dendrite to terminal button, always. Always. So, if we're going to look at truly how a signal is passed down the cell, because what really makes it different from any of the other cells? Well, it has something called a resting potential across the membrane. But that sounds scary, but all it means is that there are charges on the inside that aren't on the outside. So the inside of the cell, because of the membrane being semi-permeable to pretty much everything with a charge, means the inside of the cell can be more negative, about negative millivolts, than the outside of the cell. And that's all the membrane potential means. The way the cell ends up firing is through sodium and potassium channels, which specifically are bridges across the membrane that allow those charged particles in particular to pass, and they can close and open, which is what allows the membrane potential to change and then suddenly carry an electrical current through the changed potential. But we're going to go much deeper into this in exactly 2 seconds because it's important to see it to really understand how it works. So again, pardon my horrific drawing skills. I'm trying, so this is a closer view of the axon. What's important that I don't label in this drawing is there are the black areas that are kind of partitioned off. Those are glial cells, which are along the axon that denote where there are spots on the axon for the charge to be created. I'm also going to put a small diagram of charge versus time, so you can see how the charge on the inside of the cell membrane changes as steps are going along, and it's going to be beautifully color-coded, or to the best of my ability color-coded. I've labeled -50, that's -50 millivolts, and the dotted line is called the threshold. The threshold is essentially at what point the cell is definitely going to fire, that it like knows for a fact that this whole process is going to continue, because the cell is going to fluctuate a little bit frequently, but the threshold basically tells the cell that it's happening. So first of all, the cell will receive an excitatory signal. So the dendrites will pick up neurotransmitters, which are just chemicals that tell the cell what to do, from the previous cell that tell it it's going to fire, and that'll cause the sodium channels to open. So drawing them as best I can open, and the sodium can now cross from the outside of the cell into the cell. And you can see on the charge diagram that the green line indicates that the charge is going up, and we've crossed the threshold, so now we know that the cell is going to fire. And then you have the potassium channels open. And because both potassium and sodium are positively charged, the potassium is also going to raise the charge inside of the cell. So potassium enters the cell, and the charge gets a lot more positive. At the peak of this curve, the sodium channels then close, because the inside of the cell has gotten as positive as it's going to. So then that'll level off, and then the charge will start to go down again as the cell kind of recuperates what its normal resting potential is. Then the potassium channels will also close, which will allow the charge to get even more negative again. And then it gets too negative for a moment. It's past its -50 millivolts. Ooh, excuse me, just deleted all of that by accident. So I'm going to redraw all of these as closed because that's where we are right now. But everything in the cell is a little bit too negative, so the cell is going to end up pumping different charges in and out through other channels in order to restore the correct inner charge of around 50 to 55 millivolts. And the period where it's too negative is called hyperpolarization, because the cell got too negative at that moment. And you can see it scoots itself back up a little bit. But this happens multiple places along the axon in between each glial cell. The glial cells will prevent the channels from opening and closing at that point. So this is just a singular point where the electrical current will be made, and it'll hop between all of the glial cells as it travels down the axon to the terminal buttons. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you like it, give it a like. I'm going to be producing hopefully a lot of these, but again, thank you for watching.